Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this month's, the next class in a series of classes on the new car forms that are taking advantage of how we do real estate in the post-NAR settlement world. Today's class is going to be on the new BRBC. I'm going to go through that, pretty much clause by clause, get you very familiar with it, and then we'll have time for questions afterward. I'll take as much time as necessary after that. So let me share my screen and get started here. Find what my presentation is. All right, everyone can see that, I hope. So, again, real quickly, how you reach me during business hours, the direct landline is best. I function better. If you call my cell, it might take me a little longer to get back. Good news is Mike calls my cell, so I look at my cell phone a lot during the day. So I will get back to you, but you can reach me easier on my landline. You can always email me, of course, and after hours, weekends, if you're working, I try to be available as much as I possibly can. Good news is I don't have a lot of life outside of real estate, so I'm available a lot. That's good. And I don't mind one bit, so never feel bad or apologize. If I answer the phone, you're not disturbing me. Here's a little insight. If I'm being disturbed, I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm pretty, I have my own boundaries, so I'm not answering the phone when I'm asleep or other times. But if I'm answering the phone, it's okay. All right. So, all right, I want to share something with you, a quote I came across. Some people respond when they see the light. And I would say that's everybody on this call. You see in the light, why? It looks like we're going to have to be doing BRBCs. We're going to have to remove broker compensation out of the MLS. Things are changing. Others, when they feel the heat, people not on this call might be in that category. They're not responding yet, but they will, when it gets closer and closer to a deadline and they have to have BRBCs. And still others will not budge until they're burned. They want to write, they want to represent a buyer, but now they don't have a clue on how to prepare a BRBC. And sometimes not even then. And here's a thought. And again, I'm preaching to the choir, you're here. But let me point out that you're in the group that does see the light, and that's a special group. What kind of person do you want to be? The answer to that question will determine the kind of life you're going to lead. I would say it'll determine the kind of career you have in real estate. If you fight this, it's one thing to be confused, struggle, have a problem with it, of course, learning how to play the piano is difficult. You play a lot of wrong notes. It's confusing. It's a struggle. But if you want to play the piano, you learn how to do it. If you want to do real estate, you're going to learn how to get through all of this. This came from a book written by David Lieberman. I can recommend this book. It's phenomenal. Don't if the title makes you wonder, gee, does Walt have a problem? Never get angry again. Do I have an anger management issue? I like to think I don't. This book is phenomenal. I sort of read this book because I sort of subscribe to this concept. Nobody ever leaves a confrontation of any kind saying, gee, I wish I'd gotten more angry then. So I think it's a good idea to I deal with a lot of people that sometimes are a little angry on the other side, and sometimes I get a little angry too. We all do. So this is a great book. I recommend that. But this quote I think applies to our situation. All right, so let's talk about the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement released July 24th, as a matter of fact, 2024. All right, so as you've seen it before, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement is a grid format to begin with, and then it has clauses in the body of the contract that explain in detail some of the things in the grid. So the first thing is, of course, you identify the broker, your buyer, and you identify the broker. It is a non-exclusive representation agreement. And we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. But it's a non-exclusive agreement. It can be exclusive, and we'll see these paragraphs in a minute, if you check the appropriate box in paragraph 2A2 and initial paragraph 15. You'll see that. Absent doing both of those, you do not have an exclusive agreement. You would have a non-exclusive agreement. What does that mean? You'll find out in a few minutes. We'll go through that. All right, so the terms of the representation are outlined in the grid, and the grid contains, as all of you know, the more negotiable aspects of the contract. So just like the RPA has a grid, the RLA has a grid, so does the BRBC have a grid, and we're looking at it now. So the first thing is the representation period, and it has a beginning and ending date. Again, I'll remind you, you have to have an ending date to have a valid contract. So don't forget that. And then the other note is the maximum period of time is going to be 3 months, although it's not law yet. In January 1 of 2025, the law requiring agents to have a buyer representation agreement with buyers they represent also includes a maximum term, and that is going to be 3 months. We lobbied to make it longer. That's not working. They're now lobbying to make it 90 days rather than 3 months because it's easier to count that. But we don't know. So you can renew it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You know, it's easy to renew it, quite frankly, so you want to do it. All right, type of representation. As I said, it's non-exclusive by default, or it could be exclusive if you check this box and initial paragraph 15. And we'll define what that means in a few minutes. Property be acquired. The good news is this is very simple. There is a belief, legal belief, and it's based somewhat on case law, that a certain amount of information must be provided in order to have a valid contract. However, as you'll notice in this grid, there's not a lot of information required here. For example, what you don't see in the grid is the price range. The fact that you don't have a price range in this contract will not defeat the contract. But if you do not specify the property type, it could be defeated. So if you'll notice, the default is single family. Now, if they don't want to buy a single family, you're working with an investor, no, I'm not buying single family, then you would exclude the single family. And then there's a whole host of other types of properties that you can represent. Now, you can check as many of these, I believe, as possible, as necessary. The next is location. That's a requirement. And another principle is if you have a contract overly broad, it's what's called unconscionable. And unconscionable means on the face of it, nobody would think it's realistic. It's not fair. I hate to use the word fair. You know, it's a different seminar, but it's just not reasonable. So a BRBC that says anywhere in the state of California, the court will throw that out in a heartbeat. So you must specify a location. So you can specify counties or cities. You can name more than one county. And so those of you who also do some stuff in Riverside and Orange County, San Diego County, you could probably name 3 counties. And because they're all pretty close together and we have offices in the northern end of San Diego County, you know, you could name those 3 counties and you would be fine. And that's what I recommend. I personally recommend counties over city, but you know, you make your choice. Okay, additional buyer preferences. Now that is a form we'll cover next week where you can list, the buyer can list other kinds of things they want to look for: number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, whether it's single story, you know, whether it has a large lot, you know, the price range. So you would attach that. And then the BIPP, if you check this box, that will print, I believe, with the form where you want to print it out and then fill that out with the buyer. I want to make a note. I put all the related forms in the handout for you so you would have them to refer to as you go forward. All of the information in the BIPP does not have to be satisfied to have an enforceable BRBC. So if they say they want 3 bedrooms and they end up buying a 4-bedroom house, your BRBC is still enforceable. You put San Diego County and they buy a house in Marin County, they can pay you if they want, but if they don't want to pay you, you don't have an enforceable contract. So hope that concept is pretty clear. All right. Properties excluded from representation. Now, this would be, you would list addresses where the buyer has already been shown a property by another agent. And so this can be very important. You want to ask the buyer, have you seen other properties? Because you want to exclude those. You want to know about those, because even if the buyer wants you to show them that property because they didn't like the buyer, the first agent rather, you might have a problem. That's going to be agents have a phrase, I'm kind of flattered by it. That's a Walt call. So you may want to call me on what the situation is there, because it's a little more problematic than procuring cause. Procuring cause is really not that difficult to establish. This is, or defeat, I guess, somebody claims that they're procuring cause, but they're not. We don't defeat procuring causes, unethically. But some people think because they showed a house that they're procuring cause in the old days. No, you got to do more than just show a house. Today, showing the house might be all you need to do to be paid a BRBC. So ask the buyer what are properties they've seen, list them, and of course, if they've seen a lot, you would attach a list of those properties. And that's to protect you more than anything, so you're informed. And because that it's going to be difficult to enforce a BRBC against a buyer who saw a house with another agent and now saw it with you and you knew about it. Now, if you didn't know about it, that's a little different issue. Okay. Compensation. So this is the big one. This is what everybody's concerned about, obviously. So amount of compensation specified, a percentage, and any dollar amount. So don't list TC fees, but if you're asking the buyer to pay your TC as well, then add that to the dollar, to the percentage. It is important to note that you cannot be paid more than what is in this field or what is on a modification of terms of MTBR, modification of terms, buyer representative. If you try to change that after showing the house, that could be problematic. So I hope this is clear. Some agents have expressed this, and it's been talked about a little more and more by Car Legal, and with ethics and other considerations. So you agree to represent a buyer for 1% because you want to make it easy for the buyer to sign this, assuming that sellers will usually pay 2.5%. So you find a seller that'll pay 2%. And so you want to modify this to get that extra percentage. That would be a little late to modify this, and that could be problematic. Call me if you're in that situation. We can talk about it, but that is a clear demonstration that you're putting your financial interest ahead of the buyer's. Even if the buyer says it's okay. Everything's wonderful till it's not. So the buyer says, sure. 3 months after escrow closed, and they have all kinds of problems. They talk to an attorney. They didn't get the kind of credit they wanted. Maybe they were discouraged. Maybe they were turned down, for repairs. And the attorney looks at the paperwork and says, well, wait a minute. How come your agent got that extra 100%? Oh, because he found out the seller had that available. You will have a problem with that. So I hope that's real clear. You can modify this when you decide, you know what, I'm working pretty hard for you. And that 1%, I didn't cut it anymore. I want 2%. You don't identify a property yet, that's fine. But to change it just to take advantage of a situation where the seller will pay more could be problematic. So it's a case-by-case basis. Talk to me about it. All right. Payments received by the broker from the seller or others. If the broker receives compensation for the buyer representation, the amount will be credited against the buyer's obligation. So it tells the buyer right there, look, if the seller is willing to pay me 2% and this agreement's 2%, you will not owe me anything out of pocket. The seller will pay this on your behalf. And the broker cannot receive anything in excess of what's in 2E1 up here in this field up here. The continued right for payment for broker-involved property. This is going to be more important than ever. You show property, and the buyer doesn't, decides they're not sure they want to buy it, and you are for sure, the agent who qualifies, that property qualifies as a broker-involved property, and now your agreement expires, and a month later they buy it. You have a pretty good case for compensation. And so you want to consider this. I wouldn't skip over this. Now, if you want to skip over it, that's fine. I'm not telling you how to do your business, but protect yourself and be sure to fill this out. Now, this is not valid unless you put a number of days, calendar days in this representation period. And I think probably the longest it can be is 90 days, because that's the longest the representation period can be. You want to go longer, let me know. I've already made an inquiry, and I was told the same thing. Probably not, but I can push it a little bit more and see, what if our agents insist on longer? Okay. Cancellation rights. This contract can be canceled. For non-exclusive, it gets a cancellation upon the receipt of the notice, or you can make it X number of days after receipt of the notice. For an exclusive buyer representation agreement, cancellation is 30 days after receipt of the cancellation. Okay, buyer financial and personal information. The more I study this, the more I'm working through all this, the more I'm realizing this is a pretty important part of your buyer presentation and the paperwork you want from the buyer. So look at this. Time to deliver the buyer's personal financial information. There's no option that says, whether the buyer will do it or not. The assumption is, yes, they will do it. You have a right to expect it. Now, the question is, when will they do it? Now, for some, they may want to, do it, a couple of days later. And for others, it's going to be provided up front. Why is this important? This is how you get paid. Think about this in this frame. This is sort of like a lender or maybe a seller wanting a pre-approval letter. Yeah, I'll sell you my house. I'll take it off market. I have no idea if you got any money. I have no idea what your credit is. I'll just keep my fingers crossed. Those of you who list property, you would never allow your seller to do that. Well, let's make sure this buyer can buy your property. Let's make sure they have the money. Let's make sure they have the credit. They can get a loan. Think of it this the same way. You're going to represent a buyer. You're going to put all kinds of time and effort. How would you like it when it's time to, write an offer, and they say, oh, by the way, we don't have any money to pay you. None. We're scraping every dollar we have to make our down payment. So good luck. If you can get it from the seller, good for you. And the seller says, no, I'm not giving it to you. And you spend 3 months with this buyer. See, that's my point. So this, CAR did an excellent service to real estate agents. They didn't make this some kind of an optional. And I didn't realize that a month ago. I didn't really think about it, but I've been thinking about it lately, as you can tell. So you either get it with the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, or you get it within 5 days. The buyer financial and personal information. That's what the BFPI is. The buyer financial and personal information. That's going to be an important form. All right. Other financial considerations. This is where the buyer tells you, I don't have money to pay you. And further in this contract, we'll talk about what do you do in that case. But some buyers don't, and that doesn't mean you won't represent them. At least initially attempt to solve this problem. Okay. Or the buyer needs to tell you if they're using a loan that doesn't allow them to pay you, which means the seller has to pay you or else. VA and FHA do allow, that is, yes, they do allow buyer to pay buyer agents. So they took the FHA VA options off this form because those loan products do allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. But they left a provision here where there might be a loan program that this buyer is considering that doesn't allow that. So if they're using a loan program you're not familiar with, you might want to explore with the lender, is buyer allowed to pay buyer agent compensation? Okay, advisories and addenda disclosures. The broker compensation advisory, the BCA, which is required, and as Lindsay said, it does print with this form. It's automatically attached. And you're going to want to review that with the buyer as a part of going through this form anyway. So you're going to want to have that. All right, compensation to broker. There's the mandated requirements that commissions are negotiable, nothing new there. And now let's look at the more details about the broker right to compensation. So you are entitled to compensation as follows in this paragraph. The compensation specified in E21, which is that first field where the compensation is listed. So in a non-exclusive contract, which is the default of this contract, if there's broker involvement, then you're entitled to compensation. And broker involvement, you're going to see, you're looking ahead, is going to be defined. I'll walk you through that in a minute. If it's an exclusive representation agreement, of course, paragraph 2A2, we just covered it, has to be checked. And paragraph 15 has to be initialed. You'll see that in a minute. And then finally, broker involvement. It also defines what a buyer is. Anybody related to the buyer is a buyer. So broker involvement is defined. And you'll see it's pretty broad. The buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. All right, I'm involved. I'm entitled to compensation. Broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. So you got on the internet with them, you got on the phone with them, and you walked them through the virtual tour. You submitted an offer. You performed like a market analysis or reviewed specific documents and disclosures relative to this buyer and this particular property. And then, the property was introduced to the buyer by you. However, and and I'll just complete that sentence, and you have performed some activity relative to that property other than just sending them the list. So sending a buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer. So just merely reserving every buyer property in the MLS wouldn't work. Every property in the zip code they're interested in, I just send them a list of all those properties. Now I'm involved. No, you're not. You have to review each property with the buyer. All right, hope that's pretty clear. Now, the continuation of the right to compensation, as I said before, I think that's a pretty important clause. So let's look at that. So you're entitled to compensation provided, and again, in 2E1, which is, that commission percentage or dollar amount during the continuation period, and that's specified in 2E3. That's that blank you're filling in. If the buyer enters into agreement to acquire the property during that continuation period and provided you were involved in the property, broker involvement. All right. Now, your right to compensation, according to this paragraph, is only preserved if you deliver a list of properties that you were involved in. And that's on form the NBIP, Notice of Broker Involved Properties. Notice of Broker Involved Properties. Accounting for payments to the broker if the broker is also represented by the seller. So if you're getting listing compensation pursuant to the RLA listing side, and if it's the old RLA, it's the difference between the top number for the total commission and the lower number for the commission you're putting in the MLS or offering a buyer agent. That difference is what you are entitled to, and that will not be credited against what the buyer owes you. If it's a new RLA, that amount that's on the new RLA, the new residential listing agreement, that does not get credited. That's totally compensation for representing the seller. All right, payments received from others less than the buyer compensation obligation. So if the buyer and the broker, they should discuss that there are ways that you can ask other people to pay you. And if they agree to pay you, then that relieves the buyer's obligation to pay you. Now, if the seller agrees to pay you but doesn't, and they agree to pay you in the RPA, they agree to, through to a seller concession to pay the buyer's agent. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Well, we'll talk about that next week. And that is a paragraph on the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement, that is 3G3. All right. If they don't pay you as agreed, then the seller assigns to you the right to go after them. And I think I've talked about this before. The benefit is that way you don't have to have the buyer sue the seller and then pay you, which is technically, traditionally, how these kinds of things work out. It's pretty hard to ask your buyer to, they got the house they want and they're happy, but now I didn't get paid and the seller was supposed to pay me. I need you to sue that seller. They probably don't want to do that. So this form allows you to go directly to the seller. So that's a pretty important clause. All right. And then any payments that the buyer's agent receives from anybody else will be disclosed to the buyer not later than close of escrow. Cancellation of the buyer representation agreement. That's important to look at because the buyer has the right to cancel. So do you, as a matter of fact, as an agent. So either the buyer or the broker can cancel this agreement by giving written notice. And at any time specified in paragraph 2F, and that is either the 30 days if it's an exclusive, or immediately if it's a non-exclusive, or if you like, put in 5 days in that blank for non-exclusive. So that's there. And then the broker shall be entitled to compensation during the representation period or the continuation period that's specified in 2E if the buyer acquires that property and the broker was involved. So prior to or immediately after the cancellation, you want to deliver a notice, a written list of broker-involved properties to the buyer within 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation. And then the buyer is advised to notify any other broker of your rights to this compensation, even though the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement has been canceled. And likewise, if an agent has signed a BRBC with other agents or been shown property and been shown property, not or, and been shown property under that agreement, you're going to want to know about that so that you can be prepared that another broker may have rights to compensation from this buyer. Properties excluded from representation. So let's look at that a little bit. First of all, there's an advisory here. The buyer should not be signing multiple buyer representation agreements. Doesn't mean they won't, but they're advised to avoid that. And then the buyer shall inform you if they've signed any other agreements, whether exclusive or unexclusive. And then disclose if another broker showed them property or, wrote an offer or acted in any way in the buyer's behalf. Did you give you a virtual tour? Because that buyer may owe compensation to that earlier broker, even though they buy the house through you. Doesn't mean they don't owe you compensation as well, but the problem you got is now you got a buyer owing 2 compensations. And whichever agent's the bigger bulldog is the one that'll get paid. I don't think many buyers are going to pay twice. They might, but it's not going to be a pleasant situation in any regard. So important to know that and look into that a little bit. If the buyers have signed an exclusive buyer representation agreement, broker involvement is not necessary. And so, the buyer may owe a compensation period, if the buyer purchases a property that was covered by that exclusive agreement, even though there was no broker involvement. And as you saw earlier, what kinds of properties covered? The location of the property. That's the big thing, So where's the property located? Any property in San Diego County. Oh boy, we got a problem here. You signed an exclusive. The buyer should disclose in paragraph 2D, and that's those blanks, a property that any buyer is obligated to pay another broker. And there's 2 or 3 blanks there. Could be, it's not nearly enough, and I showed you that a little bit ago. You check that box, and then you attach a list. Conflicts with other brokers, that the properties identified in 2B, excluding any properties specified in 2D. So 2B is where you listed the properties you want to buy. Properties located in San Diego County. Excluding properties listed in 2D. These are properties I'm excluding from this agreement. Buyer's telling you in advance. The buyer is stating he's not entered into any other properties. He's not entered into an exclusive agreement with another broker and has no obligation to pay under a non-exclusive agreement. So you're asking the buyer, and this is important later if we want to make a claim, the buyer is acknowledging he has nothing to tell you there because you're asking him, look, you got to tell me this stuff. The buyer has not entered into an exclusive representation agreement with another broker. That's what this default says. And has no obligation under a non-exclusive representation agreement to pay compensation to another broker out of acquisition of this property. Again, it's property specific for a non-exclusive. So let me clarify that a little bit in case you're confused. So a buyer signed a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement, and that agent showed him property all over Mission Beach. And they decide they don't want to buy in Mission Beach. They want to buy in Pacific Beach. Now, the first contract said, if you buy property in San Diego County, so, if that first buyer showed the property in Pacific Beach as well, he would be covered. But if you came along and you showed him property in Pacific Beach, and the first agent never showed him a property in Mission Beach, hope I haven't lost you yet, that buyer has no obligation to pay that first agent because there was no buyer involvement in Pacific Beach property. Now, where that could get confused is, oh, no, that first agent sent them all kinds of property and they did virtual tours on Pacific Beach. And the buyer said, you know what, I don't want to buy in Pacific Beach. I want to buy in Mission Beach. Looked in Mission Beach with that buyer, decided, no, I guess I am going to go back to Pacific Beach. See, so it can get a little complicated. That's why you want to ask. Have you seen these properties in Pacific Beach? No, none, okay. Have you had a virtual tour of these properties? Have you called that first agent and said, can you check out this property on Jewel Street? I think Jewel Street's in Pacific Beach. See, no. Okay, good. I think I can represent you. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did ask my agent to check on that property. That looked kind of good. He sent me all kinds of information. Well, that one might be covered under the first agreement. Hope that's kind of clear. If you get involved in this, give me a call. I got a feeling we're going to have a lot of confusion figuring all this out eventually. All right. Broker authorizations and obligations. All right. So I want to go down this list with you real quickly. I want to point out a couple of things real quickly. So you're obligated to locate and present properties to the buyer for them to consider. All right. As a directed, you order reports and investigations, for the buyer. Provide the buyer a list of professionals. I want to comment on this. You can give the buyer a list of professionals like inspectors, plumbers, whatever, as long as you have no reason to doubt the professional qualifications of the person you're recommending. So if you recommend a handyman to do plumbing work, you could have a problem because he's not a plumber. You recommend a licensed plumber to do plumbing work and his license hasn't been suspended, or you don't know that the last 3 times you recommended him, all 3 buyers had a horrible time. You have no reason to doubt the professional competence of the plumber, of the physical inspector. It is not a big risk to recommend them. So, you have a favorite inspector, a favorite plumber, a favorite roofer, as long as you know, or maybe I should say it this way, as long as you don't know that they're problematic. The very fact that they're licensed gives us a lot of protection, but you want to confirm their license. It hasn't been suspended or revoked. Because if you recommend somebody who you've had problems with in the past, or it doesn't have an active license, that's where you get in trouble. But recommending a plumber who's licensed and you have no reason to believe they're not good, and then they screw up the house royally, going to be very difficult for the buyer to sue you. They would sue you under a concept of negligent referral. And negligent referral is when you refer a plumber who you shouldn't have. See? But referring a plumber who screws up does not qualify as negligent referral. I wanted to help you with that because you're going to want to be helping your buyers, and I want you to pick the best services. We have a list of people that our other agents have recommended. It's in Agent Hub, and that's a good place to go before you shoot out a message. Look there first before anybody know a plumber. We got plenty listed. Lindsay maintains that. So look on that list for people we recommend. And people are on that list because agents have said, these guys do good work. Now, a little side note here. If you have a bad experience with one of these guys, maybe let Lindsay know. We'll make a little note. And then if a second agent has a bad experience, that's exactly where we'd want to remove that person from somebody recommended, because we would have reason to believe they're not as good as we thought they were. All right. Wanted to cover that. That's why I spent some time here. And then assisting the buyer with the financing process. You're recommending a lender, great rate, hopefully, and, helping them get pre-qualified or pre-approved. Right, financial and personal information. Remember, I talked about that. That's going to be a very important form going forward for you, because you want to make sure that either the buyer can pay you, has the funds available to pay you, or if they can't, that you make sure to include that in a provision in your RPAs that the seller will pay it on behalf of the buyer. So, the financial information will be provided within a paragraph at 2G1. I covered that. And then if either box is checked in 2G2, and that's where you don't have the money, the buyer, not you, the buyer doesn't have the money, or the buyer is using a loan program that doesn't allow you to be paid, then the buyer is pre-authorizing you to include your payment in the RPA. And that's accomplished in paragraph 3G3 of the residential purchase agreement. All right, buyer material issues. Want to spend a couple of minutes with that. That form has been updated. It's back in the library. That's the good news from Walt's perspective. You all know I love this form, and there's a handful of agents on this call that love it just as much as I do. Why? Because they've gotten out of pickles because they executed that form. So the buyer's obligated to give us, if they have any material issues, and you want to ask them, don't be passive. We require this on buyer transaction. If you're the seller and don't represent the buyer, we don't need this. We don't have to have this form. This buyer material issues - specific property, the BMISP, only for buyer clients. So you want that. That's proactive. You want to get that early in the transaction, preferably as quickly, immediately after the offer is accepted. We'll cover that in detail next week. And that will go a long way to protecting us if a buyer later makes a claim that there was something that they told you about that they didn't want, and they ended up getting a house with that. That's basically what it does. And they have an obligation here that if they don't tell us, that they indemnify us. And basically can't sue us because they didn't tell us about their issues. Dispute resolution I've covered before. In contracts between brokers and principals, there is no arbitration. And as a company, I do not recommend we pre-agree to arbitration. We can always add it later if we want to. So, and I've covered that in a past class if you want to know the details. Arbitration can be good, cannot be good, depends on your perspective. There is mediation in every contract. Arbitration option exists in all principal to principal contracts. So, buyers, basically the RLA and any other purchase agreement, we offer the option for a buyer and a seller to agree to arbitration. That's up for them. Just because Walt doesn't like arbitration doesn't mean I'm necessarily right, especially in all cases. So they can have it if they want, but we don't have it. But we do have mediation. Mediation is in every contract, and there's no requirement to initial anything for mediation. All right. Exclusive representation. Here's where that is defined. We defined earlier what broker involved property is in a non-exclusive agreement. So what is exclusive? Well, first of all, it's exclusive if that box in 2A2 is checked and this paragraph right here is initialed. And the agreement shall be exclusive if this is initialed, and the buyer should not enter into any other agreement, because if they buy a house, whether you're involved in it or not, with an exclusive agreement, you're entitled to be paid. Compensation, you get compensated during your representation period, even without broker involvement during the representation period. I'm sorry. And the representation period can be extended by the protection clause. Forgot what they called it now already. Okay. And then finally, cancellation. If the buyer or the broker unilaterally cancel this agreement, by giving 30 days notice, then if you provide them a list of properties that you were involved in, you may still be entitled to compensation, even if they purchase one of those properties after the representation period or continuation period. That's the word. And of course, you need the buyer's initials. Now, this is only necessary if it is a exclusive agreement. Confirmation of compensation. This pre-fills when you put in the compensation in paragraph 2E1. Why? Because if you have the seller agree to pay you, you have to document you're entitled to that. And so you can do that by providing just this last page. It's signed by the buyer, this last page, obviously, and has a confirmation of the compensation the buyer's obligated to pay you. The seller has no obligation to pay you more than what's on the compensation field right here, even if they're offering more, even if they agreed in the RPA to pay more. And then you finally got around to provide. By the way, you can send this back page after the offer is accepted. That's fine. You don't need to send it with your offer. But if you send it after the offer is accepted and the compensation the seller agreed to pay you on the seller's payment to buyer broker, the SPBB that was made a part of the RPA, we'll cover that next week. And it's more than what the amount is on this form, you're going to get the lesser amount. Hope that's clear. And then finally, the buyer understands and has received a copy of this form. I did this, obviously, pretty obvious. This is on there. I wanted to remind you, one way that principals can defeat contracts with real estate agents is to successfully argue they never got a copy of it. So, you do a lot of digital stuff and then they're going to have a copy. That's good news. But if you do something face to face, when you return to your office, immediately copy it and send it to them or send them a copy so you can document they got a copy of it. That received a copy is not just some words on a clause. That is part of contract law. If you do not get a copy of a real estate contract that you sign, it is not enforceable. Okay, entity buyers, that's pretty straightforward. Buyer's signature there, broker signature there. That completes the BRBC. So let me stop my screen share. And Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. The first question is, can any concessions offered by the seller be memorialized in counter offers?
Yes, absolutely. Right. I'm going to cover this. I'll just share this with you now because, I want you to be sure that there's two types of concessions. General concessions which some agents would argue might cover everything. I'm just going to ask the seller to pay a concession, period. And that'll cover me. That's a mistake. Why? Because lenders have limits on what sellers can pay to buyers. And so those limits range on the high end of 6%, and I've seen it as low as 2% on different loan programs. I think FHA, for example, is 3%. I'm not 100% sure of that, but nonetheless, here's the good news. Lenders who allow buyer agents to be paid have agreed that the amount of money paid to the buyer's agent on behalf of the buyer, paid by the seller, shall not be counted against concessions. Allowables, seller paid allowables. So where this comes up in the past, you have a horrible house, needs a ton of repairs, and seller says, I tell you what, I'll give you a $30,000 credit. Great. And the maximum credit amount is $20,000. That 10,000 is lost. It goes away because the buyer can't receive more than what the lender allows. So that's why lenders approve credits. Lenders have agreed that any credit designated as compensation to a buyer's agent will not go to that cap. So on the RPA in paragraph 3, the residential purchase agreement, paragraph 3, there's a top concessions, 3G1. That is for all concessions other than buyer agent payment, not including, other than. So do that. So I want 2% to pay my closing costs, and this house needs carpet. I want some more money. So I want 2%, and of course it'll be designated a closing cost credit in escrow. You could ask for 2% in 3G1. I'm also paying the buyer broker. I'm asking the seller to pay my buyer broker 3% because that's what I signed up for. And the seller said, sure. That's going to be in 3G3. Now, to the question that was just asked, if you do a concession in a counteroffer, make sure you designate if that concession is for buyer broker compensation, make sure you designate that portion or all of it because you won't know what the repair credit is. So when you're putting this contract together and shooting back and forth counter offers, if you just say seller will pay concession of 3%, the lender is going to say, well, that's a general concession. If you need some repairs and the seller wants to give you credit for that, sorry, you don't get it. So you would say, if it's just for the buyer broker, you would say in the counter offer, seller agrees to pay a concession of 3% to pay the buyer agent's broker. So you specify that, just like if you put it in the 3G paragraph, 3G1 and 3G2, you would have separated it, 3G1 and 3G3, I'm sorry. I hope that makes sense. I just want to make sure you separate concessions between agent payments and any other concession. Okay, next.
If I had a client to sign a BRBC a month ago and the term was for a year, do I have to do a new BRBC with the new agreement, or would the old one be honored?
I believe the old one will be honored. That's a great question. I'll confirm that, but I believe the old one's grandfathered in because there was no civil code when that was signed limiting the buyer representation agreement. So whoever that is, shoot me an email just to remind me, but that is a great question. And then I will answer it in Agent Hub so all of you who have BRBCs will know.
What if the buyer was shown property by an agent who did not have the BRBC in place?
Well, the only problem you're going to have, and again, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want people to think we're unethical, but procuring causes are not easy to prove. And we've helped agents who we were not the person that, we've helped buyers and we were not the agent who first showed them the house. And then when they bought the house, that first agent was saying, oh, no, I'm the procuring cause. I want the commission. And procuring causes are between buyer agents, not listing and buyer agent. So buyer number one sues buyer number two. Buyer number two is the one who wrote the offer, got the commission. Buyer one wants some of that. Those can be dealt with pretty easily. I would say that that's what you got if the agent showed the property without a BRBC. He might have done that tomorrow. There's no requirement tomorrow for a BRBC. He could be a non-NAR member, and he showed the property in October. NAR members are required to have BRBCs starting August 17th, not non-NAR members. Non-NAR members will be included in this requirement starting January 1. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that associations, even though NAR screwed up this lawsuit to some degree, the associations are still your friend, because they immediately went to work on, look, this requirement for BRBC needs to be universal. We don't want NAR members to be at a disadvantage with potential buyers. Hope I answered that question.
Can you please explain the compensation schedule on the BRBC and when would we use that?
Well, you know, be creative here. You might have a schedule where, you know, if you buy a $1 million house, then I want 2%. If you buy, you know, more than $1 million, I'll accept, you know, you buy up to 1 million, I want 3%. Between 1 million and $1.5 million, I'll take 1.5 or you know, 2%. So as the price goes up, your compensation might go down a little bit, because buyers might convince you that, look, you're going to do the same amount of work, doesn't matter what the purchase price is. You know, this is a $2 million house. You know, are you going to charge twice as much if I bought a $1 million house? Now I could do a class, I'm not going to do it here, on how you could handle that. But you also might just say, I'll make a schedule. You might also do this. If I happen to also represent the seller, Mr. Buyer, I'm willing to charge you less as the buyer's agent. Because if you represent the seller and the buyer, dual agent, you're going to have two compensation agreements, an RLA that the seller pays you and a BRBC that the buyer pays you. But you might say, you know, sort of a tweak on that, you know, what you say to sellers, look, if 6% or 5%, but if I represent both sides, or 4.5%, you might do that with a buyer. So those are the kinds of things that might come up.
Buyers are asking, why would I put 2.5% when the listing is offering 2%? How would you explain that?
Well, hopefully you're writing the BRBC before you know what the listing is offering. You're writing that BRBC when you meet the buyer, right? But if here's the point, yeah. So the buyer calls you. You never met the buyer, and they want this house. And so you say, okay, well, let me check on it. And you look at it and you notice that they're offering 2% compensation. You know, and they're not going to offer 2% compensation. Let me rephrase that. They're offering 2% seller concession. Well, I can ask for all that 2%. That's good news. The buyer can, you know, to pay me. So now the buyer would like to see that house and would like to buy that house. And you write up a BRBC. Could you put in 2% there? Sure, you could. If you put 2.5% there, you're not going to get that 0.5% if that buyer buys. I'm sorry. If you put in 1.5, you're not going to get that extra 0.5% if the buyer buys that house. So you want to put in at least as much as what's on that transaction. But let's look at it even further. So the seller's willing to pay 2% in a concession. So you sign a BRBC for 2%, and it does not get accepted. And suddenly you're looking at houses that are offering you 2.5. You can't collect that half unless you amend the BRBC. And you do not want to amend the BRBC at the same time you're writing an offer for that 2.5, because that's going to smack of an ethics violation. You would want to do it ahead of time. Mr. Buyer, I wrote this up at 2% because the house you wanted 2%. But normally I charge 2.5%. So I'd like to amend that to 2.5%. And if sellers are willing to offer a concession of 2.5%, we're going to ask the seller to pay that on your behalf. So you would amend it then.
Can I clarify that
Sure.
question? So I think it's mostly coming from the buyer. Because, you know, so the buyer sees on, I mean, right now it's on the MLS, right? So they know that the buyer broker compensation shows 2% on the MLS, but my buyer broker agreement shows 2.5%. And so it's a conversation with the buyer on, well, wait a minute. So am I going to have to pay that 0.5%? So that, I think that's the, issue that we're, going to have to deal with, that either saying, yes, you have to pay that 0.5%, or no, I'll accept just the seller compensation. So, I mean, I think that's my point.
All right. And again, I don't want to do a seminar on objection handling right here, but the way you would approach that is, what if the seller is willing to pay 2.5, even though they put in the MLS 2%? Let me ask you a question, and Kay, you're the buyer. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard of somebody changing their mind? Ever had somebody say, no, I won't do it, and they end up doing it? Right. Has anybody told you no, but later they said yes? Don't lose that thought. So why don't we do this? I cannot ask for more. The fee I would normally require is 2.5. I'm not saying I wouldn't work with you, and again, be careful, but you could make a verbal commitment, honor it, by the way. I don't want to have a lot of calls. I wouldn't with you, Kate. I wouldn't from people on this call, so I'm not too worried. But you could say, I'll tell you what, 2.5 is what I charge. A lot of buyers will pay 2.5. If this house is perfect for you and the seller will not give us the 0.5%, I'll waive that. Yeah. Okay, you got it. Next.
We could also raise the price of the offer.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There's a lot of discussion on how you handle that. We could ask for a few more dollars. I mean, offer a few more dollars.
Would you recommend putting 3% in 4B?
Oh, I don't want to answer that question. I would ask you to do some soul searching on your part. The market is shifting from 3% universally. You're talking to somebody who took 95% of their listing after I learned. When I first got in real estate, I didn't know any better. My commission was whatever the seller paid me. Then I figured out that ain't working. Then I was 6%, and you had a hard time getting me down, really, because I was good at the objection handling. I've noticed that 3 and 3 doesn't seem to be the norm anymore. 5 tends to be the norm. So I'm not arguing go with the norm, but I will say that if you're asking for 3, you got to have some good reasons, some objection handling skills, because I think the public is more and more aligned to 2.5. I could be dead wrong. There are people on this call that still get 6%, and they're going to get 3, and they're skillful at it. One key is, one way to get your commission, by the way, is I'll tell you this one tip. One of the reasons I could be very strong on commission, there wasn't a week that didn't go by I didn't have 3, sometimes 4 listing appointments. So if you didn't want to pay me 6%, that's okay. Good luck. Next. Okay? When you're desperate, if this is the only appointment you got this month, that seller has a lot of power over you. You have, sometimes I had 2 the same day. So if I didn't like the seller, I could politely walk away, and sometimes the seller would stop me. You're not leaving, are you? Well, yeah, we're not. Good luck. I don't want you to do anything you're not happy doing. No. So if you have a lot of buyers, you're going to have a better time getting a good buyer compensation.
Give me a call.
Hey, Walt?
Yeah.
Yeah, so to me, if you put it at 3% and the seller will pay 2.5, then you can just drop your commission.
Yeah.
But if you have it lower and then the seller's paying higher, then you're saying that you're going to lose it. So
Yeah.
why not go at 3%? It's easier to go down, right?
In a nutshell, that's exactly what I would say. Now,
Okay.
how do you handle that with the buyer is going to be what kind of relationship you have with the buyer. There's agents, I won't name her because I want to embarrass her, but she can say anything to her clients and they're going to believe it is gospel. It's a blood oath. So she's going to get away with saying, look, let's put in 3%. If we only get 2%, I'll come down to 2%. They won't even question her. They'll say, okay. And away they go. There are other agents, maybe no one on this call, but we may know somebody who the client doesn't trust us so much that if we say, I'll come down, well, I want that in writing, so, I wouldn't put that on the BRBC. I think I'd put it in an email. I've agreed I'll lower my commission. All right.
If you do put 3% in E1 and the seller's offering 2.5%, do you have to do a modification to drop it down to 2.5%?
Yeah, I would say technically you should, but I'm not too worried. Buyer's not going to sue us later. Oh my gosh, I agreed to pay you 3 and you only got 2.5. We're not going to get sued for that. So if you didn't do a modification of terms, I'm not going to lose too much sleep. I think escrow may want that. If I think about this, I think escrow is not going to want to have a BRBC that they're going to now require. I'm going to talk about that going forward too. They're going to require that because they're going to start having to pay buyer agents on what authority? I called them up and said, hey, by the way, write me a check, no. And so they see a BRBC at 3 and yet everything's 2.5. They don't want to get in trouble for only paying 2.5 because they could be sued if the agent said, no, you were supposed to give me 3. So yeah, the shorter answer, I guess, is yeah, you should do it.
Can you repeat the drop dead date to start using the BRBC?
The drop dead date for using the BRBC is August 17th. That's the NAR settlement goes into effect August 17th.
Would you recommend requesting a copy of any previous BRBCs the buyer has signed? Most buyers don't understand what they have previously signed.
Yes, absolutely. That way you can advise them, this is exclusive. Did you realize that? One of the reasons CAR made agents and buyers jump through 2 hoops to make it exclusive is they wanted to prevent buyers from inadvertently signing exclusive contracts. And in fact, that's why they made it non-exclusive the default, because old timers, not to label anybody, that's me, I would have, at first blush would have said, no, make exclusive default. That's the way to go. And if they want to make it non-exclusive, we'll discuss it. But I buy into their argument. Their concern was buyers don't know anything about this. And they're going to start signing these things like Lindsay just said, like the question was, they don't know what they're signing. And so to make it more public consumer friendly, and I think I support NAR and that belief. I think they did a good thing. We'll make it non-exclusive the default to somewhat minimize the buyer inadvertently getting themselves in trouble. And if they really do want exclusive, you should have the ability to point that out and have them check a box and initial a blank.
If the buyer intends to ask the seller to pay for the broker's compensation, where would we add that in this form?
If the buyer intends
to ask the seller to pay the buyer's agent, where would we add that?
you don't add it on the form. You would put that on the RPA, on the residential purchase agreement. Now, what the form does have to protect the buyer is notifying you that they can't pay you. And so there's that little boxes that I talked about on the form that you can check. And that's in paragraph 2G2. Buyer doesn't have the funds to pay you. Or the buyer's using a loan that they can't pay you. And then the clause kicks in. I don't remember the clause number that automatically, if either of those boxes in 2G2 are checked, the buyer, as a part of the BRBC, pre-authorizes you to include that in the RPA. And by the way, if you include it in the RPA, I don't know if I covered it, but it's an important point. If I include it in the RPA and the seller says, nope, sorry, I was considering it, but I'm not, and the buyer doesn't have the funds because they told you that, you can cancel it. That contingency favors you. Your representation is contingent when a buyer does not have the funds on the seller paying you.
If you send page 5 of the BRBC to the listing agent with the offer, then they'll have all the buyer's information. So the email, phone, current address.
That's why you don't send it with the buyer. And I would black out an email and address anyway when I send it. I don't believe you should send it with the offer. I don't think that's necessary. You know, it's clear. If the seller says, I'll pay it, they're going to pay it. And they don't pay more than what's on the form. So shame on the buyer's agent if they're asking for 3 and the seller agreed to 3, but the form says 2. Because elsewhere in all the paperwork, it says you're only going to get 2. Okay? So you don't need that as part of the offer negotiation. Some listing agents and sellers will never ask to see it.
Well, I just meant if we're in escrow already and they're asking, or if they're asking to accept the offer, we send it over, but blacking it all out works. I can do
Yeah,
that.
that's what I would do. Yeah. And that's a great question, Brenda, because you should not be giving the other side your client's contact information.
Are we allowed to charge different buyers different compensation rates? So
Oh,
for buyers,
be
go
very,
ahead.
very careful with that. You know, implicit bias is very, very easy to prove. Very. And I would say, knock on wood, we've been insulated from that to some degree because there are so many issues between buyers and sellers that bias doesn't come up often. But I can tell you, in my conversations with Car Legal, that is a big concern, big concern. The way to not, okay, let me rephrase that. A demonstrable defense against bias is consistency. When you start charging one buyer one amount and another buyer another amount, I'm not saying that's bias, and I'm not saying they'll win the lawsuit. But if you charge every buyer the same amount, they're going to have a much harder time making a claim that you charged me more because of my ethnicity or my religion or my sexual lifestyle. The courts tend to be pretty savage about some of that stuff. They you know, we know the old adage, you're innocent until proven guilty, but most real estate agents have a corollary to that, unless you're a real estate agent. You know, then you're guilty until you can prove you didn't do anything wrong. So I would be very careful. You know, I'm not saying you can't do it, and there's good reasons to sometimes charge a different amount, but I wouldn't be all over the place. And, you know, today I would never do what I did my first 3 months in real estate. My commission was all over the place. Why? Because I accepted whatever the seller was willing to pay. You know, weak sellers paid me 6%, and tough sellers, you know, got away with paying me 1%, 4% total listing. I didn't know any better. But I was brand new to real estate, and I came from a field where I could give away $30,000 or $40,000 in a 5-minute phone call. You know, I was a contractor, and problems come up. You know, suddenly I'm 30,000 light on this project because somebody didn't do something. Oh, well, next. I had that same attitude when I went into real estate until I figured out, wait a minute, this ain't working right. I gotta get tough.
Can you
Oh.
please repeat the forms we need signed for existing listings taken prior to the changeover?
Yeah, if you took a listing prior to the change, you want a DMLA, disclosure and modification of listing agreement, and a BCA, broker compensation advisory. And Lindsay will put out.
Yeah, we're gonna put out an email with all the details.
Laying all this out. We've been working on this for a while.
What if we're in escrow already?
Then you don't need it.
Yeah, you don't need it.
If you get 2% concession from the seller, but they're willing to pay more, can they agree to prepay the flooring provider or plumber?
Yeah, yeah. They would give that. There's a couple of different ways to do that. It could be a concession to the buyer in addition to the buyer agent compensation because, you know, money's money. So if I give you $2,000, you know, off your closing costs, now you have 2,000 left in the bank to pay the floor. So we all understand that. That's how credits work. Sometimes, and I don't want to get into the weeds here in this call, but sometimes all of the credits are used up and we still need the flooring contractor paid. So you're exactly right. Sometimes we, you know, it takes a little bit of sophistication. That's why you call Walt. I've got forms and experience. We will put together something where the buyer's flooring contractor got prepaid through escrow because we ran out of room with credits.
Who are non-NAR members?
What's that?
Who are non-NAR members?
Well, all the major brokerages are members of NAR. I'm trying to think of the one brokerage that pulled out of NAR that's kind of big. Might have been Open Door. I don't think it was Redfin. I don't know who. But, you know, small independents. When I first came into real estate, I worked for an independent. They're still in business today. He was not a NAR member.
Is it okay to ask the seller's broker how much compensation they're going to be offering?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You know, is your seller offering compensation? How much? Have you had that discussion? Well, you might consider upwards of 2%, you know. They may be, some people can be real strict and say, no, I didn't discuss amount, because theoretically you don't want to discuss amount. I think it's a point to a matter you will.
After decades of the seller paying commissions on both sides, what % of buyers do you think will pay their broker's commission?
Well, it's a great question as far as having, you know, we'll have a margarita and sit around and talk about it. I think initially sellers or buyers will not want to pay, but I think ultimately buyers will begin to recognize. Let me phrase that. I think initially this concept of buyer paying is going to be what are you talking about? You know, I think over time buyers will understand that, and those that have the money will pay it, and those that don't have the money will want the seller to pay it.
If you're representing a buyer that you know cannot pay the 2.5% and are expecting to negotiate that the seller pay 2.5% and the seller won't pay that amount, if the buyer wants that property, what can you do? Can the buyer cancel the BRBC, then go to the seller's agent directly and be an unrepresented buyer?
Well, I would argue you don't need the buyer to cancel it because you can cancel it. If you can't be paid, you should be canceling the BRBC. There's some question, I haven't researched it in total, but I'm familiar with the concept that E&O does not happen if you're not compensated. I have not personally experienced this, but I know brokers who have. And so I'm researching that to make sure that any parameters that come up, I understand that. But in general, let me repeat that. There's a possibility if you're doing a transaction totally free, that there's no E&O involved. All right. So, and besides, you know, your time's worth something. So if an orphanage is buying a house, then let's talk about it. But if, you know, if the seller doesn't have any money, well, you know, I don't go into, you know, I drive Volvo, so this won't have the impact. I have a nice Volvo, but I don't go into Mercedes-Benz and say, I don't have enough money for this car, but I still want it. You know, that ain't going to happen. So if they can't afford you, I'm sorry, I don't work for free. And you're not a charity. You're not an orphanage. You know, the person talking to me, you know, you're not, you know, the mother of our holy faith trying to, you know, buy some kind of rectory or something. No, I'm so in those cases, we'll discuss it. But so you can cancel if they can't be paid, and then they can go unrepresented or talk to the buyer's agent, the listing agent, and see. But again, now let me show you where this could be a mess. The buyer's agent is in a protected class. The buyer asks the buyer's agent, who's in this protected class, to include the protected class agent's compensation on the RPA, and the seller says no. And the buyer, protected class buyer agent says, not the buyer, the buyer's agent says, I can't work for free. I'm going to let you go. Maybe you buy it unrepresented. They go to the listing agent, and the listing agent convinces the buyer, the listing agent convinces the seller to pay a buyer representation fee to the listing agent in addition to the listing contract commission. Look, hey, seller, I have this buyer and I don't want to work with them unrepresented. I'll represent them, but you got to bump it up 1%. You got to pay 1%. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a BRBC 1% ask for this on this offer. And the seller says, yeah, okay, you're my agent. Yeah, I'll work with you. Yeah. That protected class buyer's agent has a very winnable implicit bias complaint. Not saying there's implicit bias there, but do you see how this can really be a mess? That's why if the seller's going to say, I'm not going to pay it. Now, if he says I'm not going to pay it and he goes 3 months and he doesn't pay it, then he starts paying it. That's different. But if he's not going to pay it today, but tomorrow the exact same buyer, okay, now I'll pay it, and they switched agents. See, if I'm too brief in this story, it won't make sense. But if I'm as detailed as I am, I hate to take all this time, but I want you to understand the details could be where trouble is brewing. So you want to be very careful about, lack of consistency.
Can you please discuss the 30-day notice to cancel an exclusive BRBC?
I'm not sure what to discuss. So the buyer sends you a notice. It can be an email. Send you ask to cancel, and you send them the BR, the CO BR, the cancellation agreement of a buyer representation agreement. And now that cancellation takes effect in 30 days. I don't know if that helps, but I'm not sure what the question is.
Can they engage with another broker prior to the ending of that contract?
No, because the cancellation isn't effective for 30 days. So I send you the notice today, and then I engage another buyer tomorrow. Well, yeah, I got the notice. This contract is in effect for another 30 days. It requires a 30-day notice. I'm leaving this apartment. I don't want to live here anymore. And it's, here's my 30-day notice. By the way, I'm not paying you rent now. Well, no, you gave me a notice, you get to leave. Next month, you don't pay me, but you still owe me for this month. A 30-day notice is effective 30 days from now. That's why it's a 30-day notice. So the 30-day notice on canceling an exclusive agreement, that buyer better not buy any house with another agent, because for the next 30 days or 29 days, that buyer still owes the original agent. That's a great question, if that was what your question was.
I can see some things. Oh, I was going to say, I can see some things coming up with that, because there are some agents that absolutely stink out there.
Yeah.
And you sign an agreement, and you got the worst agent who never gets in their car, never provides you anything. And then you just want to divorce, that agent. Because I get a lot of the ones that got fired by, someone that didn't do the job. So,
right. Well, and it can be a little bit of complicated. It's a case by case. We'll talk, but let's say it's an exclusive contract, so I don't have to have any broker involvement, but I still have duties I'm supposed to perform. And so maybe I don't perform any of those duties, because the premise of an exclusive contract, read the paperwork. It starts by saying the agent's going to perform a lot of work for you. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff, and we expect to be compensated, period. You buy a house because I'm going to be going to work. I'm going to start researching, blah, blah, blah. And if you can demonstrate this agent signed an exclusive agreement and then took a 30-day world cruise, I think that's been breached. So on a case-by-case basis, and I did that just a couple days ago. Agent signed the listing contract, not us, and they were verbally told that this listing contract was only good if this buyer bought the house. It was a COP type situation. They needed to list the house. Well, the buyer didn't get the house. So the agent went missing in action, but the listing contract still existed. When I ended up talking to the broker of the original company, I politely informed them, you guys do not have a listing because it's been breached. You know, I can give you 2 or 3 breaches right off the top of my head. I didn't go in the MLS, you know, and you know, the good news is that broker said, oh yeah, no question. Oh yeah, we'll let that listing go. Even if they said they wouldn't want to let it go, I'd have to tell the client, you may have to talk to an attorney, but you're in pretty good shape here. You know, so again, your point, if a real flaky buyer signs a contract, I mean, a real flaky agent ties up a buyer with a contract and then doesn't do anything, it could be breach. That could be a problem. Now, where it gets kind of problematic is this flaky agent showed a house and he's a horrible agent. Well, he still may be entitled to compensation. You know, and then, you know, everything's negotiable until it's not, right? And that's my job. So maybe we pay that agent a referral fee, you know, instead of the entire commission, because the buyer doesn't want to work with you and you don't want to work with the buyer. And I say to agents all the time, don't want to give your money away, but everybody on this call, if somebody called you up and said, hey, I have a buyer for you, I'm in Rhode Island, the buyer just moved, my best friend, he just moved to San Diego, can I get a referral fee for his name? Yeah, of course. So would you give this flaky buyer's agent a 25% referral fee to just go away so we can take care of this buyer? You probably would. We'd negotiate that. So on a case-by-case basis, David, we'll work on that. But I agree.
That also goes back to when you've got a buyer that can't afford to pay you and then goes back to the other, to the listing agent, and listing agent's seller says, yeah, I'll pay the listing agent. Interesting. You still had a exclusive contract unless you signed a release on that contract.
Right, kind of lost me, Dennis. Okay.
Well, you were talking before about the buyer that says, I can't buy this house if the seller won't pay me.
Right.
And then he goes back unrepresented, or goes back to the listing agent and says, well, you know, I want to buy it, but I'm unrepresented. And then the buyer, the seller says, I will pay my listing agent to represent you.
Right. So if they bump that commission, or more importantly, this listing agent gets a BRBC from that buyer and the seller agrees to pay that on behalf of the buyer, when he said no the day before to the same buyer with a different agent, and the difference is protected class, that could be problematic. I'm not an adjudicator, and I'm not on a soapbox, other than the fact, you know, one of my old TV shows that I used to love is Hill Street Blues. And that watch sergeant ended every meeting that started every show, be careful out there. And I just love that. That's where my take care came from. When you know, not to get all sappy on you, but I'll share this with you. That take care on the end of every single message I send comes from my heart, because you guys are in a very tough profession. This is not easy. You're the ultimate entrepreneurs. You work with the hope of being paid. You're not salaried. You don't get money. You don't get paid unless you deliver the result. I get paid if I sell your house. By the way, that's the result they wanted. I get paid if you buy a house and it closes escrow. By the way, that's the result they wanted. You don't, as a rule, get paid for writing offers, for handling escrows. I mean, that's all the work you do. That's your value. But you put everything on the line to get the client what they want. And I don't mean to be on a soapbox, but I love all of you guys. Why am I available to you? Because you got a damn hard job. All I got to do is sit there with a margarita in my hand and answer a couple of questions. you got to put up with crazy people, you know? So take care. You deserve it.
On that note, I
But
think we'll
David,
end
are you
there.
asking, can I just quickly say, is David saying specifically that they're still under contract exclusively, is what I understand, because it's a 30-day notice? So when the seller's agent asks the seller, can I get compensated for representing this unrepresented buyer? And the seller says, okay, but that buyer is still under an exclusive contract with the other agent. Am I right, David?
To a degree, yes. I mean, I think maybe it was addressed when Walt said case by case, or maybe there can be a mutual agreement between the buyer and the buyer broker agent, to say, hey, instead of 30 days, this agreement cancels in 5 days or by X date. And maybe you have a stronger case legally that way.
David brings up
Yeah,
a good
okay.
point, by the way. That 30 days can be amended. You can make a exclusive agreement effective immediately.
So I think we'll end there. I'll send Walt the remaining questions from the chat so he can answer those off camera, since we're approaching 2 hours now. So I think we'll end it there.
Thank you, Lindsay. I couldn't do this without Lindsay. I want you all to know that.
Thanks, Walt.
We're going to be
Thank you
doing a
all.
class next week. So if your question doesn't get answered, or you think of new ones, you can answer. You can always call me, as you know, and I'll look at what Lindsay sends me and send out a message to each of you, maybe call you, and make sure we get all your questions answered. Have a great rest of the day, a great rest of the week, and from the bottom of my heart, take care.
Thanks, Walt.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, Lindsay.
Thank
Thank
you, Lindsay.
you.